All right, so today we're taking a deep dive, and it's into some pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Political philosophy,
Yeah.
right? Always a good time. We're looking at John Wyclif.
Big name. Not always on everybody's reading list, but
Maybe should be, though,
yeah.
right? I mean, he really had a big impact. And to get into this, we've got mainly the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Their entry on Wyclif is it's pretty thorough.
It's great. Yeah, really helps lay out his system.
And that's kind of our mission here, especially for you philosophers out there. Let's really understand how Wyclif put his political ideas together.
Exactly. Like he's not just some random medieval guy with opinions, right? There's a whole structure to his thought, metaphysics, theology, it all ties in.
Yeah. And we want to see how that works historically, too. What was going on back then? What kind of impact did his ideas have?
Long-term implications.
Yeah.
What makes Wyclif matter centuries later?
And you can't get away from this one key concept, dominium.
Yeah, dominium. Get you every time.
Not dominion like we usually think of it.
No, this is hardcore medieval stuff. Theologically loaded term.
All right, so let's break it down. What's the core idea here?
Okay, so Wyclif, his whole political system is based on this principle. All just human dominium.
Just to clarify for everyone, we're talking about mastery, lordship, being in charge, governance, right?
Right. All that. Even property, but in a very specific way we'll get to. So all that, just human dominium, it comes from God.
God's own dominion.
Precisely. God's relationship to creation. That's dominium too.
Okay, so that's already interesting for us as philosophers. Lots of thinkers said, yeah, God influences rulers. But
Wyclif takes it a step further. It's not just influence, it's a direct causal link.
because of his ontology.
Bingo. His realist ontology. His theory of what really exists, fundamentally. God's dominium is the cause, directly, of any just human dominium.
Now, that wasn't the common approach back then, was it?
Not really. You think about other big names, Occam, Marsilius, John of Paris, Giles of Rome, even.
Sure, big thinkers.
They didn't always connect their metaphysics and politics so tightly.
Even Aquinas.
Even Aquinas, his system, very unified, but not in the same way. Wyclif, he's really unusual, this hardcore metaphysician building a whole theory of authority, both church and state, by the way.
And from that, you get this really radical conclusion.
Oh, yeah.
No private property is just
Unless there's grace involved.
grace. So he's following Augustine here, the idea that private property, it comes from the fall.
Right. That screwing up big time moment,
Messes everything up.
including how we think about stuff we own.
So what's the ideal society for Wyclif then?
Communal ownership.
Yeah.
All the way. And get this, he applies it to the church, too.
The church.
The church. He sees it as embodying that restored ideal state.
Yeah.
So no property for them either, ideally.
Okay, now think about 14th century England.
Yeah.
Church owns tons of land, right? Wealthy, powerful, Wyclif says.
The king's got to take it away. It's this divine duty, right?
Yeah,
Manage it as God's steward.
that's throwing down the gauntlet.
Major challenge to the powers that be.
Now, historically, people see him as this, prophetic forerunner to Henry VIII.
It's the Tudor Reformation, yeah. Henry VIII does strip the church of its wealth, but Wyclif's arguments, the form of them, it's medieval through and through, more like earlier Franciscan thought.
Like Occam.
Yeah, Occam, not what comes later, not by a long shot.
So, folks, just so we're clear, dominium for Wyclif. Not unchecked power, not in the modern sense.
No, it's got this theological basis specific to the medieval period.
Okay, so rewind a bit. Before Wyclif comes along, what does dominium mean in political thought?
So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Roman law, it's mostly about owning property, but it also means jurisdiction, governance, power.
All tied together.
Right. Then you've got the 12th century, papacy's getting stronger. Canon lawyers, they use Roman law to make distinctions.
What kind of distinctions?
Jurisdictive authority, that's one. Then secular power, separate from that. And then how you use and possess private property. By the 14th century.
Wyclif's time.
Yeah, it's mostly about property ownership, but often with a bit of jurisdictional authority mixed in.
Now, something interesting the source points out. Most thinkers, even Aquinas, they agreed. A ruler claiming power just from owning stuff.
That's a tyrant.
Tyrants.
Yeah.
So they knew there was a difference.
A big difference. And you can't ignore Augustine's influence here.
Augustine.
Well,
let's talk about him.
Yeah.
Two cities, right?
Yeah.
City of man, city of God.
The big division, self-love versus love of God, how does that affect dominium before Wyclif? Good question.
Lay it on us.
For Augustine, God's the only true Lord. End of story. Human mastery over other humans. That's from Original Sin. Unnatural, except for parents and kids.
Makes sense. So in the city of God, ideal ruler.
It's all about service, mutual care, not domination like you get in that messed up city of man.
And how did he see property?
Ah,
This is key for Wyclif.
property, tied right to original sin, turning away from God, claiming stuff that he created.
That famous line, all things belong to the just.
There's a but. Just owning something doesn't make you just. The point is, use your stuff for God's will. Don't get attached to it.
Detachment.
Major theme. And here's the thing with Augustine. His ideas, hugely influential, but
But open to interpretation.
exactly, people read him different ways. And those readings, they shape later political thought, Wyclif included.
Okay, so moving on. Giles of Rome, he comes a bit later.
Yes. Philip V of France, Pope Boniface VIII, huge showdown. Giles, he jumps right in.
And takes sides.
Big time. In his work, De Ecclesiastico Potestate, he argues for the Pope. Absolute secular superiority, nothing less.
Really? Even over kings?
Even over kings. Supports those papal bulls, you know, the ones saying Pope's got final say on everything, property included. For Giles, all power comes from the Pope, spiritual, secular, all of it. And guess where the Pope gets it?
Let me guess.
God.
God. The sea of force and power, he calls him. Now, about dominium, Giles doesn't use the term a ton.
But he argues that just secular power, legitimate ownership, all that depends on the church and on grace, which is basically God working through the sacraments.
Sacraments. Okay, so he ties it all together. Ownership, temporal power, all under this Augustinian umbrella.
Unifies it. And that approach, it had legs. Influenced tons of thinkers later on, even if they didn't use the exact same words.
Now let's talk about the Franciscans.
Yeah.
Poverty, right? Their big issue. How do they fit into all this?
Early Franciscans, guys like Bonaventure, they take a hard line. All property is bad. Individuals, communities, doesn't matter. Consequence of the fall, selfishness creeping in.
But Augustine said, all things belong to the just. How do they square that?
For them, that means sharing, not owning. What they call use pauper, the poor use. Basically, use what you need, don't hoard it.
But even within the Franciscans.
Oh, yeah, things get messy. You've got the spirituals, hardcore use pauper all the way. Then the conventuals, a bit more lenient, let's say.
So there's infighting.
Definitely. And then Pope John XXII steps in, gets suspicious of those spirituals.
Yeah.
Maybe worried about, those old heresies popping up again.
Communitarian stuff.
Right. So he argues, no, private property, that's a gift from God. Adam had it before the fall. It's still okay because of God's dominion.
Interesting. So this debate has consequences.
Huge consequences. John XXII and William Ockham, who supported the spirituals, they clash. This leads to early ideas about natural rights. And crucially for us, dominium starts to become this catch-all term.
It absorbs other ideas.
Exactly. Jurisdictio, jurisdiction, proprietas, property, all under dominium.
Wyclif's going to love that.
Oh, he uses it to his advantage. Takes bits from both sides. Franciscan arguments for poverty, John XXII's divine dominium stuff, but puts it together in a way neither would have liked.
Cover.
Oh, yeah. By the 1350s, there's this broader critique of the Franciscans. Richard Fitzralph, his work De Pauperis Salvatoris, really lays it out.
What's his argument?
He says those friars relying on the generosity of property owners, well, they're subject to the same rules as everyone else. Which means if they use church property, they got to obey church authority.
Trying to rein them in. And what about dominium?
Fitzralph's key point, grace justifies dominium, period. All just dominium comes from God. He sees God's dominium as tied to creation, governing, preserving, all part of it. We rational beings were like loaned stuff from creation, but still under God's thumb.
Still under God's thumb, I like that. So the fall, how does that mess things up?
He says natural dominium, the way it was before, love was at the heart of it. Fall weakens that, but doesn't destroy it. Political dominium comes along, got to regulate property now that everyone's selfish. But God can add grace to these human systems.
Hatching it up a bit.
Yeah. So sometimes they become like that pre-fall dominium. Love's back in the picture.
Interesting. So Fitzralph, pro-pope, big on grace, all under this dominium umbrella.
Sets the stage for Wyclif, who then goes even further, right?
Right.
Questions the church itself, not just the folk, the whole institution.
Okay, back to Wyclif. Divine dominium. Not just an example, not just a model, but the cause.
The cause, yeah, of all created dominium. This is where the philosophy gets really interesting. Universals, particulars, all that good stuff.
Explain it to us like we're philosophers.
All right, so in Dominio Divino, Wyclif says divine dominium is the standard prior to and presupposition of all other dominium. It's not just that we should try to be like God. No, it's that God makes just human dominium possible at all by causing it.
So grace is the link.
The conduit. God's dominion flows through grace into human rulers, into just systems.
And Wyclif, he breaks down God's dominion.
6 aspects, 3 ruling elements: creation, sustaining the world, governing it. Then the proprietary side, giving, receiving, lending.
Lending, that's an interesting one.
Oh, yeah. Key to his whole argument. So creation, that's got to come first, right? For dominium to even make sense, only God creates, so his dominium is the real deal, the only true instance. Everything else flows from that.
Now, the source mentioned something about universals and particulars.
Yeah, Wyclif says God's dominium over those abstract divine ideas, the universals, that comes before his dominium over specific things, the particulars.
So, before he governs individual humans, he governs
Humanity as a whole.
That gets into some thorny theological territory, right?
Oh, yeah, free will, determinism, all that.
Fun stuff. But let's stick with the political philosophy. This giving, receiving, lending. How does that explain why grace is so important?
Okay, so Wyclif says God's giving in creation, that's unique. It's self-giving. No creature can do that. Same with his receiving. He only receives from himself. But lending, that's where it gets interesting for us.
Why?
It's a relationship, real, ongoing, between God the Lord and us, the created subject. We don't own anything, not really. It's all lent to us by divine authority, and we can only use it rightly, enjoy it, through grace.
So everything's on loan.
Basically. And Wyclif, he distinguishes between 2 kinds of giving. There's divine communicative giving. God gives but doesn't lose anything. Then there's our usual human giving, what he calls translative. We give something, it's gone.
We're poorer for it.
Right. But because everything ultimately goes back to God, all his giving is lending.
Okay, but when you lend something, there's this question of deserving it. Right?
Absolutely. So Wyclif gets into merit. 2 kinds. Condign merit, you deserve something as a right, based on shared dignity. He says that's impossible between God and us. We're not on the same level.
Not even close.
No. Then there's congruent merit. The goodness of an act makes a reward fitting, but not strictly required. Humans, we get congruent merit by choosing good, which then makes grace possible because God's generous.
He even lends us merit.
That's the idea. As he puts it, it is the invariable law of God that nobody is awarded blessedness unless they first deserve it.
Complicated stuff.
Oh yeah, scholastic theology at its finest. But this is how Wyclif understands human dominium in relation to God's. It's all about grace.
So human lordship, owning stuff, being in charge, it's only just.
When the person in power remembers they're a steward, acting on God's behalf. Wyclif himself says any rational creature is only improperly called a lord, and is rather a minister or steward of the supreme Lord. Grace, that's what makes human dominium just. And for him, grace comes from the Holy Spirit.
So the human lord is both a master,
To their subjects.
but a servant.
To God. And grace, that's what lets them see themselves as that steward, the one taking care of things, not just bossing people around.
Okay, now Wyclif divides human dominium into 3 types.
3 types, yeah. Natural, civil, and evangelical.
And his famous line, civil justice presupposes divine justice. Civil dominium presupposes natural dominium.
So how do these 3 work together? How do they relate back to God's dominion? Big questions.
And how would Wyclif answer them?
He'd say all 3 are ways God's justice shows up in the world. Different expressions of the same thing. Let's start with natural dominion.
Okay, natural dominium.
For Wyclif, all hocus, meaning right, in creation comes from God, from his justice divine aestitia. Big difference from Aristotle, who thought humans could figure out justice on their own.
Just by thinking.
Yeah. Wyclif says no, true right has to be based on God's uncreated right. And where's that expressed?
In Scripture.
Scripture, yeah. Especially the 10 Commandments, and those 2 big ones, love God, love your neighbor.
Makes sense.
And check this out, he writes a whole treatise, De Mandatis Divinis.
About the commandments.
About the commandments. And guess what? Robert Grosseteste wrote one with the same title. Clear connection there. They had similar ideas about sin, love of God, idolatry, true faith.
Like minds think alike.
Right. Now, Wyclif, in De Statu Innocency, he describes that state of innocence before the fall. Perfect harmony, human will and God's will totally aligned, so actions are just naturally no need for human laws.
That is nice.
And no private property either. That's key. Genesis, that natural dominium, no selfishness, no mine and thine. It's that Augustinian idea again. All things belong to the just. But it's not about owning. It's about sharing. Using what God created responsibly, like good stewards.
But then comes the fall.
Boom. Everything changes. Wyclif says it's a turning away from God, a privation, like something's missing in the soul now. And what happens? We start valuing stuff too much. material over spiritual.
And that leads to
Private property. Can't avoid it. We don't see those created goods as loans anymore. It's all about me, me, me.
selfishness takes over.
And that's where civil dominium comes in, which for Wyclif is a kind of slavery. We're enslaved to stuff now.
Okay, so what exactly is civil dominium?
He defines it as, get ready for this, proprietary lordship in a viator over the goods of fortune fully according to human law.
Mouthful.
I know, right? But the point is, it's not so much about the ruler making laws, it's about private property. The viator, that's just a fancy way of saying someone on life's journey, a wayfarer.
We're all travelers.
In a sense. But remember, only God truly owns creation, because only he made it. We're just borrowing. And we can use it justly, or we can screw up, claim it all for ourselves.
So before the fall, everything's communal. After, it's all.
Complicated. Selfishness gets in the way. He identifies 3 ways we use stuff after the fall. 1, use based on owning property, according to human laws. 2, use without owning, also under human laws. And 3, evangelical use.
Evangelical use, different.
That comes with Christ. So before Jesus, it's all human laws, right? Monarchies, aristocracies, figuring out who gets what.
And Wyclif, did he have a favorite system?
He kind of liked those benevolent aristocracies, like the biblical judges, you know? He thought they were closer to the pre-fall ideal. More contemplation, more sharing, less corruption. But he gets it, monarchy is the most common.
Because of sin.
Sin, yeah. Need someone strong to keep things in line.
Mm-hmm.
But his view of civil dominium, totally different from Aristotle's. For Aristotle, the state helps us be virtuous as individuals.
Right, the polis.
But Wyclif says, no, civil dominium, it comes from original sin. It's probably not going to be just most of the time. Maybe accidentally lines up with divine justice sometimes, but that's it.
So there's this problem. Natural dominium, no private property. But civil dominium depends on it. And Wyclif says civil comes from natural.
Uh-huh. The big contradiction.
Yeah.
This is where evangelical dominium comes in, the key to the whole thing.
Right, lay it on us.
Christ's poverty, right, his sacrifice. Wyclif says that opens the door for us to get back to that lost natural dominium. Jesus, he was sinless.
The only one since Adam.
Exactly. So he embodies that perfect natural dominium, and he shares it with the disciples. They renounce all their possessions, try to recreate that communal love, caritas.
Apostolic poverty.
Right, but it's more than just being poor materially. It's a spiritual state. It's having things with love for spiritual benefit. You could be poor and still be a jerk, you know?
Doesn't automatically make you a saint. Nope.
Now, this sounds a lot like the Franciscans, right? Spiritual poverty, all that. But Wyclif, he goes further. He says Christ's sacrifice allows all Christians to regain natural dominium, not just imitate it, but actually have it.
That's a big difference.
Huge. Franciscans, they'd say they're just trying to live like the apostles. Wyclif says, no, you can be more than that.
More than just an imitation. So Franciscan critics were not happy.
Oh, yeah, William Woodford, for example. He says Wyclif's wrong. Apostolic poverty isn't the same as pre-fall purity. Wyclif spends a whole book in the Civilia Dominio arguing back. That's where his anti-Franciscan stuff really starts.
So apostolic poverty, it's having with love. And that requires...
From God.
Of course.
Okay.
And what does this mean for the church?
The church. Wyclif says it's founded on Lex Christi, Christ's law, spiritual stuff, not material laws, not possessions. So it's got to be property-free to be truly pure spiritually. Any wealth it gets, those goods of fortune, got to be given away as alms like Christ and the apostles did.
He's really hammering this point home.
Oh, yeah. He blasts the church for not being like this anymore, says the donation of Constantine. That's when it all went wrong.
What's that?
Supposedly, Emperor Constantine gave the church all this power, land, wealth. Wyclif, he'd probably agree with Nicholas of Cusa, who said it was a fake document.
A forgery. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to civil dominium, the just civil lord. If the church shouldn't own anything, who takes care of it?
This is where the king comes in. Wyclif says, look, the church exists in the fallen world. It needs protection. Thieves, heretics, attacks, you name it. And those evangelical folks living in poverty, they're not cut out for that.
Not exactly warriors.
Nope. So the king steps up, he's the guardian, protects the church, makes sure those alms get distributed, but he doesn't own it.
Just manages it. So 2 roles, clearly divided.
It is right for God to have 2 vicars in his church, Wyclif says. A king in temporal affairs and a priest in spiritual.
Separation of powers, medieval style.
You got it. And he gives the king advice in De Officio Regis. Treat your subjects right, care about their souls, make good laws and follow them yourself. Oh, and protect the poor, keep society stable. He mentions advisors sometimes, especially priests helping with church reform, but not much about parliament or anything like that.
No democratic leanings.
Not really. So the king's main job, taking away all that church property, land, goods, buildings, the lot, even if the clergy throws a fit.
Excommunication, interdict, the whole 9 yards.
Doesn't matter. The king, if he's got grace, he's like a doctor lancing a boil, getting rid of the sickness. Then he distributes that wealth to the people, but still protects the church.
Guardian, not owner.
Yeah.
Now, hereditary succession, Wyclif had issues with that.
Oh, yeah. He was worried about it. Says grace, that kingly virtue, it's not cast down through blood. Primogeniture, firstborn son gets everything. Bad idea. Family interests come first, not justice.
So what's the solution?
Spiritual adoption. Find a worthy successor. Make him your heir. Better than elections, because who can really tell who's got grace? Wyclif says, it does not follow, if all the people want Peter to be their civil lord, that therefore it is just.
He doesn't trust the masses.
Nope. Same problem in the church, right? Can't tell for sure who's got grace, so excommunication is tricky, and forget about electing priests. And grants of land that last forever. No good either. How do you know the owner's kids will deserve it generations later?
Makes you think. Okay, last thing. Tyranny.
Yeah.
How does Wyclif deal with bad rulers?
Tricky question. He knew it was hard to tell a truly evil tyrant from a strict but just ruler. We can't see grace, right? So maybe that cruel king, he's actually punishing sin. Maybe that easygoing guy, he's letting things fall apart. So be careful about judging, he says. Priests especially shouldn't judge kings. They've got other things to worry about.
Stick to spiritual matters.
Right. Now, his advice on what to do about tyranny, kind of mixed. Sometimes you gotta endure it. God's punishing us, especially if it's just about material stuff. But if the ruler's hurting the church, maybe resistance is okay.
So it depends.
It depends, but he's way more worried about priestly tyranny. That's what really endangers souls. Civil tyranny, it's just about worldly stuff. The just king, he's actually the one who protects against priestly tyranny, keeps an eye on the clergy and makes sure they're doing their jobs.
Interesting. So
Because civil law.
serves divine law. In canon law, all those church rules, Wyclif thinks they're mostly useless, human inventions getting in the way. So the king uses the bishops, who he thinks are legit, to keep those priests in line. Simony, pluralism, absenteeism, heresy, you name it,
The king's enforcer.
basically. Bishops also give the king theological advice, help him make laws that reflect God's will. So Wyclif says, just like the king is God's steward in the world, bishops are stewards of divine law. And guess what?
They answer to the king. They answer to the king. Even though Wyclif himself got in trouble with the church, he stuck to his guns. Pretty interesting, right?
So to sum it all up for you folks at home, Wyclif's political philosophy, it all comes down to God's dominium. Grace is the key. He uses his realist ontology to make some radical arguments.
Radical about property, about the church, about who's really in charge. And he's got this whole system, natural dominium, civil, evangelical, makes you think about medieval thought in a new way.
And for you philosophers out there, here's something to chew on. Wyclif, he puts divine justice at the foundation of all human law. That's pretty heavy stuff. Does that have anything to say to us today? When we think about authority, about religion and politics, about what justice even means, does Wyclif offer a new perspective on political legitimacy? Something to consider.
And if you want to go deeper, check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Wyclif, or dive into his actual writings. There's a lot to unpack there, trust me.
Thanks for listening. See ya.